So hello everyone, and welcome to the Bristol Poverty Institute's Poverty Dimensions of COVID-19 webinar series. My name is Lauren Winch and I'm the manager of the Bristol Poverty Institute based at the University of Bristol in the UK. Just a quick bit of housekeeping first. Please make sure that you've added your name where you joined the webinar rather than being listed as guest, just so that we can ensure all attendees are legitimate and we know who's asking questions. If you do have any questions for the panelists, please type them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen. Please make sure you use that Q&A box rather than the chat function to make sure we pick the questions up. So we're going to get through as many as we can in the time that we've got, and we'll be doing an open panel Q&A after all the presentations. So please state which speakers your question is aimed at. Obviously, you're welcome to put it to the whole panel, but if it's aimed at one person in particular, then please do state that at the start of the question. We ask everyone to please be respectful in your comments and questions, and we do reserve the right to remove anyone from the webinar whose comments are deemed offensive or inappropriate. Please do also tweet about this event as we're going through. I'll be live tweeting myself as well. Our series hashtag is COVID-19 poverty, so you can see on my slide here. And you can follow that as well for other discussions about the webinar as it goes on. Just finally, a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and that recording will be shared online via our website and our YouTube channel. So if you're not comfortable with that, please do bear it in mind and you may choose to leave the webinar if you prefer to. So before moving on to the presentations, I just wanted to provide you with a quick introduction to our institute. So the Bristol Poverty Institute, or BPI for short, was established in 2017 as one of the 7 specialist research institutes at the University of Bristol, and that's in recognition of our university's strengths in poverty research, and is headed up by its director, Professor David Gordon, who is in the webinar today, who is a world-leading researcher in poverty and social justice. The BPI was set up with the ambition of driving forward the university's research on causes, effects and measurement of poverty in order to better inform policy and practice. And we're very aware that achieving this requires engagement and partnerships beyond academia. So we've therefore actively encouraged non-academic engagement in this webinar series and most of our other activities as well. So the series itself was established to explore the impact of COVID-19 on those experiencing and or at risk of falling into poverty. So this webinar series aims to bring together a wide variety of participants representing different sectors with a range of theoretical, methodological and disciplinary approaches. We of course recognise that different professional, academic and civic communities will have access to different sources of information, different data sets and different tools for analysis. And may also have different immediate priorities. We are all, however, hopefully, all driven by the ultimate aim of reducing the negative impacts of this global pandemic on all aspects of society, and particularly on those communities and individuals who are already experiencing disadvantages. So by bringing together a range of perspectives, we seek to improve our understanding of the poverty dimensions of this pandemic, and by extension, our ability to influence policy and practice in order to mitigate its negative impacts. So webinars in the series have a wide range of different regional and or thematic foci, exploring those various dimensions of how this pandemic will impact on lives across the globe. So if anyone here in the audience is interested in co-hosting or presenting a future webinar, do feel free to get in touch. We'll have a slide at the end with all of our contact information, or just Google Bristol Poverty Institute and you'll find us. So moving on to today's event, we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers. I'm just going to share the speaker list with you. So you can see that we've got a variety of different topics here and different sectors being represented. There is a slight change in the first talk with a focus now on Sierra Leone instead of Uganda, but the team there do also work in Uganda, so if you've got questions related to that, I'm sure they'd be happy to take those questions in the Q&A section. So these speakers between them will explore different perspectives on the discussion of how COVID-19 has affected girls in low and middle income countries in different ways, building on existing inequalities and exacerbating challenges faced by those in or at risk of poverty. Each panellist will have 10 to 15 minutes for their presentation, And as noted previously, please do type any questions in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. So pretty much enough from me. Let's get on to the interesting talks now. So we're opening with a joint presentation from Dr. Tigist Grieve and Dr. Alba Lanau. Tigist is a senior research associate in the School of Policy Studies at the University of Bristol in the UK, and she's also a member of the Bristol Poverty Institute Advisory Board. Tigist's research interests encompasses inequalities and questions of social reproduction, including poverty and educational disadvantage of communities with a focus on gender and rurality. In addition to her academic work, she is actively involved with various charities in the UK and abroad, including the Bristol-based charity for Ethiopia, which she actually founded in 2004 and where she currently serves as a trustee. Her co-presenter today, Alba Lanau, is a research fellow at the Centre d'Estudis Demogràfics, which is an affiliated institute to the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona in Spain. Alba is an applied quantitative researcher with an interest in multidimensional poverty and the early stages of the life course. Her research and teaching span across disciplines of social policy, sociology and development studies. And Alba's worked on numerous national and international projects with organisations including UK Home Office, Tongan Bureau of Statistics and the International Organisation for Migration. So I'll hand over to our first presenters now, Tigist and Alba.
Thank you. I hope you could hear me now.
Yes, we can, Tigist, yeah.
Thank you. Hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you BPI for the opportunity to share about our project. So in the Alba will be changing the slide. Please, Alba, if you could change that slide for me now. In the next few minutes allocated to us, we will share with you about the background of the study, the methodology, and Alba will walk us through the findings and through the Q&A. Essentially, the study was trying to amplify the concerns of adolescent girls and trying to give a hearing to what they were sharing with us. In slide 3, you will see in order to give a hearing, we employed the wellbeing framework approach developed by Professor Sarah White at Bath University, and to capture essentially about the holistic aspects of the adolescent girls' lives. What we didn't want is to extract them from their reality, from their context, because each country had different contexts. It has its own challenges and opportunities for adolescent girls. So we wanted to be true to that, and we, as researchers, we are interested in the material aspects of it. It's about what people have, but also the subjective aspects of it. How do they feel with what they have, what they can do, that sort of stuff. In African context, and as an African myself, I can speak that relationality is also really, really important. So we wanted to capture that as well with by looking through that research. In slide 4, you will see I'm going to go through fast, so we have more time for discussion. Sorry if I'm too fast. This is a large project. It is what we are presenting today is just a subset of the larger project by our partner, African Child Policy Forum, which is a Pan-African organization that advocates and research around children's well-being in Africa. And this study was part of or contributing as a background study for the African Report on Child Wellbeing in 2020. The full report is on the ACPF website, and you can go and have a look at that. So in slide 5, you will see for this presentation, we were trying to focus on girls' perspective on the economic impact of COVID. So we were trying to understand what do they understand about COVID and how do they see the implication of that in their lives as well as in those closer to them. And in slide 6, you will see that the situation of girls in each country is a little bit different. Burkina Faso, for example, has prioritized improving girls, young people's access to health through the new development health national plan. In Sierra Leone, you will see there was a new national reproductive, maternal, newborn, and children and adolescent health strategy, but also there was abolishing of secondary school fees. There were comparable kind of poverty issues going on. There are some conflict and post-conflict situations girls find themselves in. There are relatively low incidence of COVID-19 in both countries in terms of death, but in terms of the lockdown markets being closed, or in terms of the economy, there is quite a lot of concern around there. In fact, the recent reports coming out suggest that any investment should prioritize girls in the path to recovery. In slide 7, so what do we know? What are the studies out there today that's telling us about poverty in relation to COVID in Africa? What we are seeing is there is a huge concern that the poverty is expected to grow, and there is also increased food insecurity projected to be there, but directly to children because of the school meals initiatives being, schools being in lockdown, there is increasing concern around daily nutrition children are getting. So majority of the study is about health-focused study, if you like, and what we are trying to contribute to that ongoing body of literature is drawing out from girls' voices, which is there. So just a quick glance through our methods. It's a larger study, like I said, it's around 87 adolescent girls involved in that. But today we will only draw from Sierra Leone and Burkina Faso. And the interview questions were initially written in English and then debated, and we had several workshops to develop them with our country-based researchers. And then it was conducted in 9 different languages, translated to English, in some cases to French, and then back to English, that sort of languages, and paying attention to girls' own local languages was also part of the thing we wanted to capture. So girls were asked about their education, about health, about safety, how they feel about that, and their hopes and dreams and things like that. But for today, we are again drawing specifically about the COVID, their understanding and the implication on their lives from their own perspective. Interviews were conducted in mobile phones. If we move to the next slide, please, Alba. And we made huge efforts to that our analysis doesn't change what they were trying to communicate, and we can talk about that a bit later on if you have any questions. Initially, the data was analyzed by country teams, and then deeper analysis, and then sending it back. So there was a lot of dialogue going on to get to the final work we have done. There were serious ethical procedures that have followed. There were parental and caregiver permission, and then double and informed consent from the children themselves. Not at once, but there were at least minimum 3 sessions of phone calls that we have made with them to get that discussion. So I think at this point, I'm going to hand over to Alba to lead us to findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Tigist. So yes, essentially, we get to the meaty part. We know that poverty is expected to increase in Africa. We know that inequalities are expected to increase, and we know also there's concerns about raising gender inequality. So what we want to contribute with this is how has the pandemic reinforced those inequalities and how this translates into girls' experiences. And we have found, doing our analysis, essentially what I call here 3+1 groups of girls according to the impact of the pandemic. So we have classified from less to more severe economic impact of the pandemic. And then we have this 4th group, which appears only in Burkina Faso, which is what we have called lives defined by conflict. And I'll tell you a bit more about each of these groups, the characteristics, and what do we learn from them. So the first group is been relatively sheltered from the economic impact of the pandemic. There are people who have essentially come from more wealthy backgrounds, particularly in the case of Burkina Faso, is a bit more diverse. In the Sierra Leone sample, but essentially their parents work in import-export trade, or they have international remittances. And for this group of girls, the pandemic hasn't had a massive economic impact on their lives, or they don't report any. In fact, some of them are very positive, as you can see in the second quote here. It's the best thing that could happen to us too. Of course, not all of the girls were that positive, and girls across the wealth spectrum or the income spectrum shared concerns about their schooling, about their future, and mental health issues. So that's also like worth bearing in mind for later. The second group is what we've titled coping. And these are girls who live in households who have experienced loss in income, in livelihood. Someone has lost their job, or they have decreased what they can do. They usually, their families are small traders, farmers, small businesses, or their families with multiple earners where they combine sources of income. And how these families have adapted and how these girls have adapted is, on the one hand, by tapping on savings and existing resources. You can see the first of the quote is like, we had all condiments. That's how we managed. So kind of using up those stocks, but also by tapping on the human resources. And you can see the second of the girls is a girl from Sierra Leone. She's 18. She works with selling salt and nuts in the street. And she used to do that on the side to her schooling. But now she says we go trading, and at night we take our book. So she's gone on to essentially work full time. And we see quite a few girls who are now working with a family business who were prior not doing that. Then the third group is the most severely affected by the pandemic. And here we have stories of hunger and extreme poverty, being unable to cover basic needs. And these are usually people who work in petty trade, informal businesses, farmers, also people who do border trading because borders are closed, as well as children who are taken care of by kin, extended family, etc. And I want to call your attention to this second quote, where it shows very clearly how this is kind of like an impact of the pandemic. So before it was okay, but because it has been a lockdown, people are not working. And then she goes on to explain how they managed to feed her younger siblings. And then she ends the quote by saying, "Me, I do not eat," which is quite an extreme coping mechanism, if you can call it that. Within this group, there's also many girls who didn't report necessarily a severe impact of the pandemic on themselves, but they reported on others. So, for example, other people having lost income, family members, colleagues, but also there's quite a few girls who mention other girls turning to sex work as a survival mechanism. And that's something that surprised us, that we didn't expect them to bring in, because we definitely didn't. And again, this is something that is linked by many of them to the pandemic. Then we had this final fourth group, which is girls who live in or have escaped conflict areas, mostly in the north of Burkina Faso, although this is extending. And here, what we notice is that violence is the key determinant on their lives. And COVID really hasn't changed much of that, the economic, schooling, mental health impact that we associate with COVID was already there. And these girls essentially don't see much of a difference. It's also worth noting that this experience of conflict is also mediated by economic resources. And you can see here in this second quote where it says, "Those who have money have sent their children away. Those who do not, their children have stayed." So again, income and poverty interlink with other forms of oppression. Okay, so just brief overview. The experience of the pandemic is severely mediated by socioeconomic and geographic position. The better off are often protected as they are in other places. The majority, or the bigger group, not a majority, the bigger minority that we found are in the coping group. But two notes of this respect. First of them is that the degree of the restrictions matter. In Burkina Faso, markets were closed, in Sierra Leone were open, and that translates apparently in more severe cases of poverty in Burkina Faso. And the length of the pandemic and the restrictions is also going to matter, because of course the ability to cope erodes over time. The networks they're relying on, the savings they're stocking, it's not something that's going to last forever. Last two slides. What do we learn? So the first thing is it's important to listen to children's voices to understand how they experience and how they cope. with these changing situations. Girls tend to downplay their economic struggles. If you remember this girl who said, me, I do not eat. At the start of the interview, we asked them, how's your life? Is there something you're unhappy with it? And she was perfectly fine, you know, she's not poor, she lacks nothing that she needs. And then you go on to the later part of the interview, and then it comes up, well, I don't eat, so my siblings can eat. So there's definitely a tendency to downplay. And also we noticed that girls tend to use local reference groups. So they compare themselves with their schoolmates or with the neighbors, not necessarily with TB or with Europe. So that's also affects how they define and experience poverty. It's difficult to identify these micro processes and the impact that they have in girls' lives, and it's difficult for the girls themselves. And girls not recognizing the pandemic having had an impact in their lives, so that doesn't mean it has not. So that's also, in a way, it's a limitation, or at least something we need to be aware when doing this kind of research. At the same time, COVID is just one of many events in girls' lives, and we see that they tend to put more emphasis in other events that have impacted them, such as losing a parent, of course, or like violence, terrorism, etc. Fieldwork during COVID can be done, and again, this is something that we can discuss maybe in the Q&A. Overall, the pandemic is likely to increase economic inequalities. It has affected the poor hardest. Support networks are increasingly stretched. So income support is needed for those who are working in the informal sector and small farmers particularly. And the pandemic is also likely to deviate transitional trajectories of girls, accelerating the end of schooling and marriage. Many adolescent girls may not return to school because they're not now working or pregnant, they've been married, and we need to find ways to support them. So responses to the pandemic and the post-pandemic must be gender sensitive. And again, just a reminder that all of this is very much intertwined with poverty, as you can see with this closing statement from one of the girls that when she was asked to define early marriage, she said essentially is when you're sent to marriage at an early age due to poverty. So thank you very much. Thank you for your input. This is work in progress. We're still reanalyzing the data, and we would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to Tigist and Alba for a really great presentation there. As I said, we'll be taking questions from the audience after all the presentations at the end. So do feel free to put them in the Q&A box now, or just make a note of them on your own paper or computer in the meantime, and we'll get to those at the end. So we'll move on now to our next speaker. So our second presentation is from Maria McLaughlin, who is a Senior Policy and Advocacy Advisor for Economic Empowerment at Plan International. So Plan International is an independent development and humanitarian organisation that advances children's rights and equality for girls. Maria herself is responsible for developing and delivering an economic empowerment policy and advocacy framework that draws on partnership, lobbying, strategic communication, public mobilisation, to advance policy changes for girls. So I'll hand over to you now, Maria. You're on mute still.
Yes, I am. Hi, everyone. Let me just pull up the presentation. Let's hope this works. Is it visible in the way that we want it to be? Wonderful.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Super. Okay. Well, thank you, Lauren, and thank you to the Bristol Institute for this opportunity to share some of these findings. What I'm going to talk about today is based on a study that that Plan did in partnership with my slides will move with Citibank. This is a study that was carried out for the most part during late 2019 and then completed in 2020. And the study looks at the case for holistic investment in girls, especially adolescent girls. And I thought this might be useful to share because this kind of gives us a little bit of a sense of the context for girls, adolescent girls, before the pandemic itself, and kind of helps us to reflect on the particular challenges that they were already faced with, and that in terms of trying to design intervention to support them, that institutions such as Plan were working with. And then I'm going to finish off with a brief study that Plan, a desk review study that we produced in 2020, responding to the context of the pandemic and looking at the impacts on adolescent girls. So if I can go into the holistic investment in girls study, and it's based on some assumptions around the pathway through adolescence for adolescent girls in particular, and how that compares with the situation for adolescent boys. And I think this follows on very well from the previous study in a couple of sense. One is that this is obviously at a very general level that we're talking, and this is kind of at a taking out averages. And also, but it does make the assumption that while adolescent boys in various situations also face a number of challenges, there are additional challenges that adolescent girls are also facing given their age and gender. So we have based this on various analysis. This is an analysis, I think, that was produced by the Gates Foundation, this particular diagram that demonstrates the pathway through adolescence, through the education process from primary into secondary, and the pathway of adolescent girls into family responsibilities and being faced as well in low-income countries and middle-income countries with child early and forced marriage, and also then how all of that impacts on their transition into the workforce. Adolescence is commonly defined as the second decade of life. The ages 10 to 19 signify a particular critical phase in life for both boys and girls, with many transitions in relation to social, economic, biological, and demographic events. So this is the kind of the cohort that we're looking at a global level, but a global level for low and middle income countries. Some key statistics around adolescent girls, again, at a global level from low and middle income countries. We know that 132 million girls are out of school, of which 100 million of those are secondary school age. So essentially, school completion obviously decreases when you go from primary into secondary. So we already had this level of challenge with this level of girls anticipated to be out of secondary school before the pandemic hit. So just kind of want to bear that sort of before and after impacts. I'll just kind of move through this then to try to get through as much of it as possible in the time. Also, just to kind of highlight, these are the assumptions that we make around the economic empowerment challenges for older adolescent girls for the Africa context. This can apply for other low and middle income countries as well. So we know that there are challenges around the lower numeracy and literacy levels, and that very much impacts whether they can get jobs in the formal sector or the informal sector. The research looks at that and also makes some projections around if you had a secondary school adolescent girls that were a cohort that was fully completing secondary school, then how would that change the formal versus the informal sector? If you suddenly had a supply of adolescent girls completing secondary school with full literacy, then they would be anticipating jobs in the formal sector, and how would the formal sector be able to respond to that? We also are conscious of these challenges around extra pressures on unpaid and domestic care, work burdens, and around their reproductive health services access, and pressure to marry early, social norms affecting all of these aspects. So some of the key assumptions of the research itself, it was carried out in 8 low and middle income countries. The countries are listed there: Ghana, Uganda, Mali, El Salvador, Bolivia, India, Laos, and Egypt. And it looked at the potential for investment in 12 years of education, so that follows through to completion of secondary school, and 2 years of investment in multi-component intervention to prevent child marriage, violence, and to promote economic independence. So that's what the study assumed, and looked at what that would cost and what the return on that would be. Some key assumptions around the research, as I said, are that increased years of schooling leads to higher productivity and higher earnings, and it also leads to better access to formal employment, and a decrease in the share of informal employment for these adolescent girls, and that this links to other research that looks at women post-adolescence, and there are general conclusions there that secondary school completion increases the participation level of women in the labour force. And when we say the labour force there, we mean the formal labour force, because that's where the data is. So just kind of to give you a brief glimpse of the analytical framework for the research. We looked at a business as usual scenario, and then also at the increased investment scenario, and tried to compare both of those. As I said, looking at 12 years of education, and then 2 years investment in additional programming intervention that would support protection from child marriage, violence, and promote economic independence. And I think the broad kind of caveat and note of caution around this kind of research is the limitations in terms of external and additional factors that can be controlled for. So we have to make a lot of assumptions around those, around tertiary education options, around labour demand, around government policies. And so the research itself doesn't take these variables directly into account. So again, a lot of kind of caveats and limitations to note around this kind of research. One of the challenges, broadly speaking, is that when we look at global data that exists, it's very rarely disaggregated for gender, and even more rarely disaggregated for age. And we know this across data and accountability mechanisms for on the SDGs more generally, that having this kind of data is a really big problem. And we know there are huge data gaps across the SDGs generally, and then additionally for gender and age. So I think the campaign around what kind of data would be required in order to be able to make any quantitative assessment is a campaign that is ongoing and needs more attention. Around the question of costing of the inputs, obviously from country to country, that's going to vary a lot. And for the purposes of the research, an average was taken across the countries, but with the acknowledgement that will differ from country to country, and therefore that can affect the outcomes for individual countries in this projection. You probably can't see that table, but this table just gives us a sense of the data sources that were available to us, so that we can do that kind of comparison, and data around young women's participation in formal employment versus informal employment. There's a mix of quantitative and qualitative data around that, and so the research had to draw on both of those. So the conclusions of the report at a high level was that kind of based on this projection, that if 100% secondary school completion was achieved, and if the investment to achieve that was in place, then that could have the result to lift GDP in emerging economies, i.e. these low and middle income countries, by 10% on average, compared with the business as usual scenario. So bearing in mind that the business as usual scenario is the pre-COVID business as usual scenario. Now, so that's, I think it was around $1.30 a day per adolescent girl is the investment rate that would cost. So the report makes a general argument that level of investment has a multiplied effect in terms of the return on that investment in GDP terms, as well as the broader social and kind of moral reason for making the investment. I'll just point as well to the graph itself, which indicates that for the individual countries, they obviously wouldn't all take the same trajectory around this kind of investment. For, I think it was Mali and Uganda, it was speculated that we're looking at where we would want to get to by 2030. This is pre-COVID, obviously, and that for all countries except Mali and Uganda, the GDP growth rate is projected to be kind of constantly upward until 2030, whereas in Mali and Uganda, the cost would be greater than the returns until it's speculated in the late 2020s, and then the positive impact is much greater than the other countries. So a lot depends as well on the baseline position. If secondary school completion rates are already reasonably high, then obviously the additional benefit of this kind of investment would be less, but where in countries where it's lower, the secondary school completion rate is currently lower, then the benefits will take longer to materialize, but they will be greater in the longer term. And I think this is really important as well in terms of this broader question of making the case for this kind of investment, because obviously this kind of investment is possible to campaign for within the context of the SDG and the SDGs and the 2030 framework, but it obviously goes beyond individual election cycles, and so there is something here about making that long-term argument. So the conclusions of that report itself were that a holistic approach to investment and intervention will have a higher return across education, child marriage and violence, prevention and economic dependence over the course of a girl's life. And also then that collaborative approaches between governments, the private sector and NGOs that best utilize the strengths of each sector are necessary. So what the report does as well is says that it's not just the education alone that will achieve these kind of benefits, that the education has to be supported with these additional interventions, and a multi-intervention approach is what is required. So I think this is the final slide. And this is just to kind of link up then with the kind of the research that is emerging over the past year, speculating around the impact of COVID on the economic, health and social trajectories for adolescent girls. So as we know, as we've talked about, there was already a very high out of school rate, especially at secondary school level with adolescent girls. With COVID and with the break to the education flow, it is assumed that a significant number of these girls who were in secondary school then will not return. So we're into further decreasing numbers and proportionally of girls that are expected now to achieve secondary school completion. So obviously this is a backward step, and we're now operating from a situation of further deficit. Around the economic impacts, as the previous research indicated at a country level, it really depends on the sector that adolescent girls are in, and they tend to be operating in sectors that are more affected by the pandemic. Some sectors that are seen as luxury or kind of nice to have sectors, for example, the beauty sectors, but also a lot around food-related businesses. And where those are hugely interrupted by restrictions, then girls are very much part of those supply chains, and so they're very affected by those disruptions. Around caring responsibilities as well, we already know about this high level of unpaid care work that adolescent girls are responsible for. But also, as the healthcare industry kind of explodes further in response to the pandemic, adolescent girls are very often the ones who are high in the recruitment numbers around those, and are more highly exposed to directly to the virus. And around child marriage as well, all the evidence is pointing to increased levels of child marriage, partly as a coping mechanism within the family, where parents are resorting to marrying their girls off even earlier. And also the impacts around domestic violence are emerging. So essentially, what we're trying to do now is match up these different pieces of work to look at the back foot that adolescent girls were already on, and what would be required to change that. And now we have to take a step further back again around in taking into account the impacts of the pandemic. And so we have to adjust these kind of these demands around the type of investment that is required. And I think as well we have to be very strategic around the ask for those areas of investment given in order to reformulate the combination of investments that we think are necessary given the additional factors around the pandemic. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Maria. That was really, really interesting and thought-provoking. And I'm sure we'll come back to several of the points you raised through the Q&A. In the meantime, we're going to move on to our final presentation, which is from Dr. Anita Ghimire, who is the Research Director at the Nepal Institute for Social and Environmental Research, NISER, in Nepal. So Anita's research experiences are primarily on migration and mobility, social norms and gender, adolescents and young people, and social protection, in addition to evaluation studies of different interventions. For the past 10 years, she's worked on numerous global research grants commissioned by DFID, UNICEF, IOM, USAID, and World Bank, among others. So she's got a great range of experience, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from her today. So over to you, Anita.
Hello, everybody, and I thank Lauren and the Institute for inviting me to this presentation, and I thank you all for the interest. So I'm going to share my screen. So this study is a part of the GAZE program, and I'm going to present about the impact of COVID-19 on girls working in the adult entertainment sector. So just now hearing from Maria and my two other colleagues, this is to be more like a very focused zoom, one country, one sector kind of, we are zooming into one of the risky jobs that adolescents work in Nepal. So I'm going to talk about GAZE and the entertainment sector study. So basically, GAZE is a 9 years program started in 2015, expected to end in 2014, which looks at which researches in 9 low and middle income countries to understand what works for enabling adolescent girls to transition into a better adulthood. And in Nepal in particular, we have 3 different strains of GAZE, and in this particular study, the entertainment study, it's a 3-year study on girls working in risky jobs, which we call entertainment sector, which is a lot about commercial sex work, but not only about commercial sex work. I'm going to explain that a bit later. But what I'm presenting now is a focus section where we did the study after COVID, following up some of our participants during the lockdown of the COVID. So here I'm going to share mostly about the impact of COVID and for girls working in the adult entertainment sector. So basically, to give you a brief idea about what is being about. So basically in Nepal, entertainment sector consists of, it's an informal economy which consists of like hotels, pubs, guest house, where girls with, and also like commercial sex work on the street, and now growingly on commercial sex work and freelance kind of sex work. So and it is both, so as I shared, it is both like establishment. This work involves being affiliated with some institutions like the hotels, dance bars and all, but also freelance. So as in case of, like, I think as in the global case, a lot of this work is exploitative, includes a lot of minors, and it includes both economic, physical, sexual kind of exploitations. The work is mostly to entertaining guests through providing service, but also, like, providing companionship in all forms of entertainment. Mostly the girls who work in sector. So basically, if you look at Nepal, this sector was concentrated in the east-west highway, which ran throughout the country. So Nepal is like it's a long rectangular shaped country. So basically, at first, this entertainment sector was mostly depended on workers. So, but now it has mushroomed into different forms. There's a lot of investment now, and it is a growing part of the along with the urbanization, it is growing in many other different urban areas of well. So mostly these girls are girls who come from the rural areas. So we did in two places in the eastern part of the country and one in the capital city, Kathmandu. So if you look at Kathmandu, for example, girls who come to these sectors are from the surrounding Fort Kathmandu, mostly from the rural areas. And when we look at how these girls enter into this sector, a lot of this is through peer network friends, but also very actively recruiting mechanisms from brokers who operate both establishment like the hotels, dance bars, but also like work as freelance workers. Also brokers now operating online, recruiting these online, or sometimes through their own boyfriends and their relatives, mostly male. So what happened to this entertainment sector? So Nepal announced lockdown on March 24, and the entertainment sector, such as the hotels, the commercial sex work on the street, so everything remained largely closed. But there were informal arrangement in establishment where, for example, a hotel manager who employed a girl to work in this sector would connect the girl to a client, so that there was like this activity going on informally between personal connections. Similarly, in freelance work, also girls who had access to clients were doing this work discreetly. There was a huge decrease in number of clients, both like face-to-face and online-based meetings. So if you see whatever I have in red are the quotes from my study. So basically, girls said that previously they had 3 to 5 customers a day, and this is a commercial sex worker speaking, but now it has become to like 1 to 2 in 3-4 days, or 1 to 2 in a week. Also changed. So because there was a lockdown, the clients could not go and meet these girls during the afternoon or the evenings or at night, which usually happened when there was no lockdown. So what happened basically during this time was the government opened, the government eased the morning and sometimes for a few hours in the evening, which means that the clients were available either very early in the morning or in the evening. For girls who had children, it meant that they did not have someone to care food for their children, so they had a lot of problems to get access to the clients of their child care duties. Also, the demand increased a lot. So for example, a lot of their clients did not want family, so they did not want to come and meet these girls because their spouses may suspect them of infidelity, but also because they did not want to contract COVID to their family members. A lot of clients for girls, particularly in 2 of the district, Indian clients who come from India, but because the border was closed, the clients were not coming. Besides this, there were new girls who worked in establishment based, but when the hotels closed down, when all of these entertainment establishments closed down, like the dance bar and all, they came to street for sex work, or they used their networks to the clients for sex work, which means that you had a lot of workers, but you did not have a lot of clients. Besides this, we also found, particularly in case of Kathmandu, the capital city, that there were international sex workers who worked through particular way where Nepali workers did not work. So these are, for example, high-end clients like in the casinos, where the clients are usually of a different portfolio, and where Nepali girls do not work as sex workers. So basically we find that the Chinese, Malaysians and African workers also came to the street as the casinos closed, which means that there was even more competition for the Nepali girls. And also because some of these international workers started operating in giving service at a very low rate. So for example, like, they charged for what constitutes like 2,500 to 50,000 Nepali rupees. They provided the work for 500 to 600 rupees, which created a lot of competition for the Nepali girls, because it was competition in the price and it was also competition in the space where they worked. So what happened during the COVID? What is the implication of all these for women, and also for girls working in this sector? And also a lot of these girls had children. Means that firstly, there was food insecurity for the girls. They were eating less food and also less quality food, but they were also there was a lot of desperations because they could not feed their children. So we heard our key informants, for example, sharing that sometimes girls would just call. There were hotlines to call some NGOs, and girls would just demand for a little money to buy poison, because great conditions, they could not see their children hungry, so they felt that one of the easiest way out would be to kill their children first and have the poison themselves. So that was the level of desperation because of food insecurity. Also, the thing is, a lot of these girls usually used to eat their 2 meals in their establishment. So if they worked in a hotel, for example, they used to eat their lunch and dinner at the hotels, which means that they were not paying so much for their food when the lockdown was not there. But because there was a lockdown and these hotels and dance bars closed, they had to purchase their own meal and they had no money. So it also they also had sometimes to sell themselves for very little food, as you can see in the quote. Sometimes they just sold their bodies for a plate of noodles, and sometimes just the clients know the desperation of the girls, so instead of food they would just buy a glass of local beer, so that they had to sell themselves for because of food insecurity. The other big impact was rendering these girls homelessness. So Nepali society is a very conservative society. The government does not recognize sex works. There is the government does not recognize it at all. But this is happening in the country and in communities, and within the parents and within the within the Nepali community, it is a very stigmatized jobs. So a lot of girls, on top of that, a lot of girls who work in this sector get addicted to drugs and all, which is also stigmatized in the Nepali society. So a lot of these girls were not welcome back to the family. Their parents did not want them to come back to the rural areas, because the girls were kind of like a black sheep to the family. And a big group of girls who work in the entertainment sector are also girls who have broken families. So for example, they eloped and they had eloped marriage, which is again stigmatized in the community. And when their partners or their husband left them, they are just living alone. So these girls basically had nowhere to go to. Some of them were living in the hotels and in the guest houses where they worked, but after the lockdown they were pushed out because the hotels closed, so they had no rooms to stay. So a lot of such girls started living in public spaces, like under the bridge, in the park, and sometimes they were sleeping in trucks and cars because they had like children with them. There was a lot of increase in gender-based violence from clients, because as you can see in the earlier quote, some clients would just buy them a glass of beer, not paying them money. Sometimes a lot of clients would take service from them for the payment of one. There was a lot of violence also from the police, who arrested them for no reasons. From their employers, mostly financial exploitation from the employers. They know that these girls are stigmatized, so they use that to not pay the girls the due earnings that they had. From their intimate partners, Also, when these girls returned back to their home, some of these girls who returned to their home villages found that their clients were in the home villages, so they were blackmailed for working in this sector, because the clients would go and tell them that I know that you are involved in entertainment work, which is stigmatized. So if you don't provide me free sex service, I'm going to tell everyone in the village, and they'll throw you out of the house, and your family name will be tarnished. So they use these kind of bargainings to force girls to provide them free services. We also found that between so in a Nepali society, between adolescent, these living in relationship is getting more and more common. So without marriage, the girls have started living together, and during this COVID, perhaps because there was no earning, there's a lot of separations between the partners, mostly infidelity. Girls complained of their boyfriends, like going and living with other girls. This kind of, and also a lot of intimate partner violence, as I said before. These separations, I felt, had a much more deeper physical and emotional challenges for the girls. A lot of them used to cry in our interviews when they talked about their separations and the violence they faced from their boyfriends and their partners. As I shared earlier, there was increased and physical violence inflicted by the police, and as I said, like blackmailing for sex from clients upon return home. Besides this, as in the usual case, sex work includes physical intimacy, so there was vulnerability to COVID infection. The clients started demanding oral sex. So for the NGO workers who used to work on preventing sexual and reproductive health infections to the girls, COVID was a new threat, because the clients started demanding oral sex. So these girls did not know like how to prevent, what to do now, how to deal with this new demand, how to safeguard the girls from these new demands. The girls, because they have lost income, they were doing whatever it takes to earn money. So as you can see, SRS service provider sharing with us that they are in a very confused state. So on one hand you have a new demand, on the other hand you have a new disease, and you have not yet figured out how to keep girls safe from this situation. We also found a lot of increase in pregnancy and other SRH infections, and a lot of vulnerability to pregnancy of these girls. So so coping and survival strategies, I didn't want to call it coping, because the more I talk to the girls, it is more a survival strategy than a coping strategy for me. So when we talk to these girls, one of the things was a lot of girls used to earn like a good amount of money, especially if they were unmarried and did not have children. They were not used to savings. They always felt that they would keep on earning this money. So most of girls who were unmarried, who did not have childcare duties, had very little saving, which they used when the lockdown was there. But also girls who had saving and had children found that because the children were not going to school, there was a greater demand for food in the house, which means that their earnings were depleted very quickly. Working for less money, working just for food was another strategy. Tailoring the service as per the demand of the clients was another strategy. And then accepting less money. For example, if you can see, clients haggle a lot for money. They take the service first and then they want to give less money. So girls also did not want to negotiate with the clients, because they just feel that even if it is less money, at least you have something to take back to their children. So they were just working for much lesser than what they would usually accept. Some girls also tried alternative livelihoods. NGOs were provided trainings on like bead making or some trainings that sell very quickly. So they tried alternative vegetable, shelling vegetable, and selling these beads was one of the strategies that they used. Cutting down food and basic hygiene, like not buying sanitary pads or shampoos, came as another coping strategy. And selling assets like their mobile phones was another of the coping strategy. But girls also got to, because of COVID, the COVID also brought these girls working in similar sector together. So when one girl, for example, had to go to the client, the other girl would help with the childcare duties so that everyone earns. Similarly, they organize themselves into groups. So if one girl has two clients, she would share her client with another girl, which means that in a group all the girls at least get some money. And and the establishment of girls group itself to share their problems, to share information, for example, about the clients, or to share information about where the deal given, so, or to connect some of their friends to the NGOs was also another of their survival strategies. So what was learned and what did we learn as a recommendation? So if we looked at goal, we found that they start, because the lockdown was for 6-7 months, they started revisiting their exploitative relationships. They started thinking about how they were exploited by their employers, by their partners, and then took decisions on what works best for them. So for example, girls even decided to stay separately from their partners and all. They realized the importance of girls group and girls agency. So previously girls shared that they used to fight with each other because there was a competition for clients. But in the COVID period, even when there was a competition for clients, they realized that getting together and working towards a solution was better. So, you know, for example, sharing from what used to be fighting for client earlier came to sharing of clients now. So if a girl, as I said, had 2 clients, she was happy to share one of her client with another girl after the COVID. So that was a lesson they learned. They learned the value of savings, as I said, and they also learned of alternative livelihoods that is less risky. So for example, selling vegetables, for example. What did we learn, and what could I think is use these new learnings to influence girls to move away from risky jobs and to take saving habits, explore alternative livelihoods. So I think this has also given us an opportunity to kind of move girls away from risky jobs. There is not much in Nepal. We don't have a secondary violence reporting mechanism. The fact that girls themselves do not report about the violence has kind of alerted us to the fact that this secondary reporting mechanism is very important, particularly in a period of crisis and for girls who are vulnerable jobs such as this. And then we found that like having children hungry is a big problem for the girls, and like right to food being and right to shelter being like a basic human rights. I think the social protection mechanism should expand for women who work in this sector. And Nepal has a very good district disaster management plan. It usually focuses on natural disasters. I think this plan should also extend itself to health emergencies. This is the new learning we have. I'm very happy to answer like your questions on methodology for the questions later, but I'll stop here for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anita. That was really, really great, really interesting, and I'm sure it will generate plenty of discussion in Q&A. We've already had a few questions through, which is fantastic, and do keep them coming. If we don't manage to get to your question, please do feel free to get in touch with my team, and we'd be happy to pass those on to the speakers for you. We'll put up a slide at the end with our contact details. So I'll get through as many as I can. We've got up to about 12:50, which is about 45 minutes UK time for the discussion if we need it. So plenty of time to explore these really important, challenging issues. So we'll try and get a balance of questions from all our panel members. We're going to start with Tigist and Alba. We've got a couple through for you guys already. I see Tigist already answered one of those through the chat window, so feel free to read through her response there on on voices of girls being obscured. So first question we've got in the chat window is from Horace, who asks whether you intend to do econometrics analysis with your research.
So I'll take that one. This part of the project is purely qualitative. That's what we presented today, but the bigger project has also a quantitative side. So you can see the full report by ACPF, where they studied lots of aspects of essentially child well-being in Africa, and there's a bunch of quantitative data there. And there's also a separate background report specifically on COVID and on the risk of COVID-19 in Africa that was led by Professor Golden, amongst others.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Alba. So we've got another question here for Tigist and Alba. So in the presentation, you mentioned that you were surprised to find that girls who experience COVID severely turn to sex work. So this is from Egle, who just wanted to ask why you were surprised by that. And actually, this might be something that Anita wants to come in on afterwards as well, because it relates to her presentation.
Yes, so thanks for the question, and that's so what we mean is not that we were surprised about girls turning to sex work, or what I meant. We know that poverty and sex work go hand in hand. There's plenty of evidence of it. It's more, we were surprised about how prevalent it was, how commonly the girls brought this up about other girls in their community, and as one of the key concerns when we asked them, what, if there's one thing you should change in your country or in your city, what would it be? And very often the answer was to protect girls from sex work and from the streets. And given that we didn't, on purpose, we didn't mention any of the sexual reproductive health or any of these topics in the discussion, we were just like surprised at how common it was and how aware the girls are about it.
Great, thank you. Tigist or Anita, did you have anything you wanted to add on that discussion point?
Just to say, the frequency was there, what surprised us, but also it needs to be qualified that they weren't glamorizing it. They weren't, it wasn't about painting a rosy picture about that. It was actually under circumstances they find themselves. Even they wouldn't talk about themselves. They were talking about other girls as a reference point. So that's really important to mention that, to recognize that.
Great, thank you. And Eglu says thank you as well. So I think that's answered the question there. So I've got a question from Shailen, which I believe is also for Tigist and Alba, doesn't specify, so anyone feel free to come in. But he's asking, did respondents mention administrative or institutional barriers to accessing public services, for example, user fees to health and education services?
Alba, do you want to take that? Or shall I come?
You can do it.
Okay. Yes, there were institutional barriers that are mentioned there, as well as institutions as an enabler. That in terms of school, for example, in the case of Ethiopia, the girls were saying they used to negotiate by threatening, I'll tell my teacher if anybody tells me to get married. And now, because they can't see their teachers anymore, they can't use those kind of lines as a threat. So an institution as an enabler, that was one of the examples. Barriers around access to health, because that was one of the main questions we asked, was also there as a concern. And what we learned in that section is actually the inequality, high inequality in many of the countries, where some of the children, the girls will mention, if I had health difficulties, my parents will take me to India, my parents will take me to Middle East, but some of the children actually going into debt to take their mums. In one case, I remember one of the girls mentioning she had to borrow from the neighbors to take her mum to health services and things like that. So yes, there were both challenges and opportunities in that sense. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we haven't got any questions in the waiting room at the moment. So obviously, hopefully people will keep sending through, and we are welcoming them for all our panelists. So do send those through if you've got anything you want to ask about their presentations. I was just wondering whether any of the panelists themselves perhaps had any reflections on their fellow presenters' talks, whether there's any areas of synergy or any issues that perhaps they might be interested in exploring collaboratively.
Sorry to be talking again, taking the mic, but yes, I was aware of the Gage's work as well as the Young Lives actually in looking at adolescent girls. There are a lot of studies out there. Plan obviously is the main champion around this. So it's really exciting that a lot of researchers are now looking into girls' well-being and specifically looking about this. And one of the challenges we find, and maybe it would be helpful to find from Anita and Maria, is the SRHR issue, sexual reproductive health for adolescent girls. It wasn't easy to research during pandemic time. partly because the conversation was on telephone and we had to be very sensitive to the cultural context, where children are, whose phone they are using, that sort of stuff. It would be helpful to hear your reflections on that. Thank you.
So Maria, did you want to respond to that from Tigist at all?
Sure. I mean, I wasn't referring to primary data research, so mine was more at the global kind of level, and looking at a quantitative and qualitative combination. And I think the challenge with that particular research was about, with the Citibank holistic investment research, was about quantifying the many variables in order to be able to make the kind of projections that we wanted to be able to make. And so kind of recognizing the limitations within that, and being able to quantify enough variables in a credible enough way to be able to make that kind of statement about the relationship between investment in adolescent girls and GDP growth. I think that kind of some of the broader challenges around that are, if we talk about more adolescent girls completing secondary school and therefore having more access to formal economy jobs, then there are all sorts of benefits for them in that. But I think what's really interesting, connecting back to your research, is that those jobs and businesses in the informal economy that adolescent girls are currently doing will still be required to some extent. And so, you know, what happens to those services? You referred to kind of the petty trade, some of the petty trade industries, and the kind of the economies that operate selling in very small quantities, because that's what the market can kind of buy at times. And so, you know, it's about trying to kind of imagine those kind of scenarios. And I think that what that does, and I think your research reflects really well, shows the significant contribution of adolescent girls and young women to particular sectors, and the price on them individually of serving some of these sectors, right through from retail and food related sectors right through to sex industry sectors. So I think that is the value of their work and the personal price to them versus alternative livelihoods, and them actually having more control over where their own livelihoods go. I think that is the really big question, and I think that's where kind of our research has come together to look at, you know, how do we get more of that control back to them? And I think that's what the argument was really in this particular research, was saying that secondary school is a big part of that. But secondary school alone actually won't do it. You need these other complementary interventions. And so the interventions that we were looking at were interventions about preventing violence, preventing child and early marriage, and about promoting that kind of economic resilience and linking to safer livelihoods and the kind of options that were indicated, especially in the last speaker. So I think those are it's about imagining different scenarios and kind of where we would like to get to and what kind of investments would be required for that, but also for the girls in this current generation, what kind of journey that they would go on, and having their voices in that, and them influencing those decisions and those investments.
Thank you very much, Maria. So Anita got disconnected, so she actually missed your question there, Tigist. So I don't know if you wouldn't mind just repeating it, and we'll see if she can come back now.
Hi, Anita. I was just to say, in terms of methodology, we find it really difficult in COVID times, to ask sensitive questions. And we were very careful not to ask that or cause any embarrassment for the girls. In particular, on the phone, it was really difficult. It was phone they were using, and we were actually ringing several times, short calls, long talk calls, and things like that. And how did you get over that to hear about sensitive issues, for example, around sexual reproductive health and such kind of data? Thank you.
Looks like she's just been disconnected again. I've made a note of your question in the chat window, and I'll send it to her as soon as she's back, and we can go from there. Apologies for that. David Gordon, I saw you had your hand raised a couple of minutes ago.
Yes, I had a question for Anita, but since she's not here, but I've also have a question for Maria. I like very much your econometric analyses of the GDP growth by getting 100% secondary school attendance for girls. I think those kinds of analyses are really important to make a case, as you emphasised. Other countries which have gone through that kind of process have found that, of course, there's a decline in the return on education, but somewhere like Mexico has also found that once you get to the secondary school near to 100% completion, there's a kind of boost to the kind of high value work that young people can do, but there does need to be investment in job creation to go with it. Otherwise, you can get the situation that you've got in North Africa, where you had lots of children who'd gone through schools and had relatively good education, and just then came into a labour market where there were no jobs, and the ILO predicts in those circumstances you can get conflict. So I wondered what you thought about was what the investment that was necessary in job creation once you got to more girls attending secondary school.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think that's kind of what I was getting to, and I was saying that it's all very well to kind of speculate that about increases in productivity and therefore the relationship between that and GDP growth. And I think that there is a pressure, especially when you're building this kind of research for advocacy purposes, to kind of to hook into GDP type language, but recognizing that actually that's only really a very small part of the picture. So I think that the kind of the next layers of that are about thinking through if you actually had this number of secondary school completed adolescent girls who also were able to avoid early marriage and were also able to avoid sexual and other types of violence, and who also had choices around their economic empowerment, then what kind of economy would be able to absorb all of them? And I think that's the really big thing. And I think that I also think that kind of part of that political challenge that you referred to in terms of kind of North Africa and Arab Spring and kind of lack of absorption of educated youth. The other thing that we know about North Africa is the very low rates of labor market participation for educated women. So, you know, then we come into these other types of questions that actually governments are not nervous about having big cohorts of educated young women in the same way that they are nervous about having big cohorts of educated young men. So I think that's a really important factor to kind of bring in as well when we're kind of trying to plan through these sorts of scenarios. So it's a question about it's about thinking about where does the pressure lie, and there what are those pressure points that you know that we can work with, and so that's why I think that when we're talking about young women, we have a tendency to kind of go to the sort of GDP type of language, because, you know, and more than with young men, because young men do carry that sort of kind of threat and sense of threat around them, and all the kind of the funding that goes towards kind of youth economic empowerment related investment tends to go towards young men in greater numbers for that very reason. So there is a huge issue, and therefore I think that this is where organizations like PLAN and academic institutes and need to come together to kind of build that sort of argument together. And I very often it comes around a combination of two things. One, about the economic impacts of doing it successfully, and how then the benefits of that, and the kind of payback to the economy of that. But the other side of it is we have to talk about the cost of not doing it, and also there has to be some sense of there has to be some sense of loss, essentially, if of demonstrating that if this doesn't work. And so essentially what that's kind of what I was referring to. All of that was what I was referring to early on in the presentation when I said this research assumes that there is a formal sector to absorb young women. So I think also this has to be very much linked to the question of sector development and which sectors we're actually advocating for countries to invest in that have a higher absorption rate of decent work options for young women. So, you know, these are the factors I think that need to be taken into those sorts of arguments.
Can I add something related to this? Yes. So it's bringing it down a bit to our own research as well. One of the things we noticed that we weren't able to talk about today is essentially that the girls are also very aware of this kind of situations, and many of them have clear ideas about what they would like to happen with their education. And and it's not only necessarily going through secondary school, and which also, but like lots of them are asking for trade training, right? Learning things that can allow them to find a job or to work alongside, and apprenticeships and things like that. And so this is also something that needs to be considered, of course, like is one of how we make the pandemic gender sensitive. Like this is how we adapt things for girls, and just remind again that girls know all of this and have very clear ideas as well about how the economy works and what would work for them.
Yeah, I mean, if I can respond to that, I think absolutely. They're extremely shrewd and canny, in my experience of kind of doing the primary research work as well. I think that when you're doing this kind of research as well, you have to be a little bit reductive. And so I think now we're kind of getting into the nuance, which I think is really, you know, that's the benefit of these kind of webinars. So when we talk about 6 years of secondary school, we mean, you know, 12 to 18, when in reality, vocational training should be an option for the second, third years of those 3 years. And then there's a question about, do you really need the full 6 years? With 3 years of secondary school plus a year or two of vocational training as an option. You know, are these kind of combinations as well better value for the girls and for the countries? So I think all of those need to be taken into account. From primary research work that I've done as well, I used to do a lot of research work around market assessments, looking at what markets have opportunity for expansion. In Sierra Leone, for example, I did a lot of this kind of work, and also then which of those are better at absorbing young men and which are better at absorbing young women. What are the opportunities for decent work conditions as well in those types of environments, and what are the opportunities for better earning? Which of those sectors have better earning opportunities, and which ones also have more career progression opportunities, you know, defined according to the girls' terms as well. So I think that those are really that's the stuff that we do need to be kind of digging into in terms of thinking about where that goes. When then we talk to employers as well, linked to that kind of work, and you put together those combinations. So I'd be very interested to know if your work has touched on this as well, and what kind of findings you've had. It always comes down to literacy and numeracy. And the education people don't like it when you kind of be that reductive about what education is at the end of the day. It comes down to literacy, numeracy, critical thinking, problem solving, teamwork, and being trustable. So that you can be left alone to run the shop, and the employer can go off and go to other wholesalers and look for additional supply chains and expand their business, and that young person can be trusted to run the shop. So for me it's about an education package that builds all of those skills essentially. And what they've said time and time again is that the actual technical skills that are required, especially in countries that don't have very developed technical training services, and again Sierra Leone is a good example of that, they will train young people that they see are worth the investment. So they're looking for those young people that have that list of literacy, numeracy, and so-called soft skills that we've just talked about, and they will do that additional work. So I think that that's where, when we talk about multi-component intervention alongside education, we do need to be talking about what kind of education we're talking about. We need to be talking about, if we're looking at literacy and numeracy, literacy in what language, and is it the language of the market versus the language that someone speaks? And you can spot immediately a young woman that has been to school and hasn't been to school, and somewhere like in West Africa, whether if they speak English or they speak French. And that's the big divider. I did this kind of work in Nepal as well in the past, and you can go in as a researcher and assume everybody speaks Nepali, and an awful lot of researchers, and kind of institutions like Plan will assume that kind of thing. If you are able to write your name in Nepali and sign agreements and can open a bank account without an X, these are the kind of things that actually leapfrog young women in these kind of situations. So I think it's about unpacking literacy in what language and in what areas, what kind of stuff do you need to be able to write and read, what kind of numeracy, and then which of these additional social skills and life skills and soft skills are required, and what sort of components, informal education components as well as the secondary school components would be required, in addition then to the hard skills that come through technical training. So it's really about deep diving into that sort of combination.
Right, thank you. That was really, really interesting. Did anyone want to respond, Tigist or Alba? I see you're both kind of moving a bit as if to imply you did.
Well, yeah, I don't think there would be enough time to respond, but I'm really interested about government getting nervous around investment and stuff. That would really be a fascinating thing to explore around how we could research that. And it's interesting for all the global development community would be interested, I'm sure, in that. But I just wanted to plug in, because education and poverty is really important, the stuff that's going on. And BPI is going to run a major conference in April. I'm sure Lauren will tell us in a moment. And one of the sessions is looking exactly about, for years and years and years, we've been researching education and addressing inequality in that sense. And education has been actually, there has been a rosy picture painted around how you can graduate from poverty if you have education. And you just mentioned about what sort of education, what kind of education, quality of education and learning, what things we are learning or advocating for girls to learn. So if you are interested, watch the space, and BPI will be advertising soon. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you, Tigist. Just to say, we do have potentially up to another 15 minutes or so. So if you did want to kind of comment in more detail in response, but shall we pass to Alba? I think you wanted to say something on there as well, and then we can always come back to Tigist if that suits.
No, I just wanted to encourage Tigist as our education expert to talk more about it, because I know she's very passionate. It's something that we've had many heated discussions about. Just quickly to come back in one of the things it's been mentioned, Alba also mentioned it in the findings, and Maria did mention it. Many of the girls, I would think we need to recognize that Africa is very, very diverse. Each country has very elite, very capable, very able, very connected communities, as much as they have people in need. And we can talk about, is Africa really poor? That's another thing we can talk about as well. But in the context of the data that we've collected, many of the girls were involved in informal sector, and they were very productive for their family. They were very responsible in earning sufficient money to contribute to the family, to the household.
but also to continue their education in context where education was there. And they were very much acutely aware of inequality in access to education, in access to health, in access to many of the opportunities that their friends or other people have. Also, girls that were living in a well-to-do families were very much aware of inequalities, and they were giving a reference about their friends, they were giving reference about people who are experiencing poverty and how difficult it is for them. Referring, oh, I don't have to worry about this because I have a mom and a dad who can look after me, whereas some of our participants weren't necessarily living with their moms and dads in a household. In different research, I found 16% of the children were living outside of their biological family household. So children's mobility and relation to education and how mobile they are frequently moving, and the education system itself was as a constraint. In some cases, when you are moving from village to village, you have to bring your paperwork in order to register in another place, where you are in a context of a country where you have to learn in different languages from different regions. That's another barrier for children going back to a class behind that, things that they've studied already. So there are so many things in education system that we can all study and advocate for, and the governments and the global community also can do. I think there are huge opportunities in that for us to consider equality and inequality. Thank you.
I do want to add to this something that connected to what Tigist just mentioned about like how girls are very aware about how other girls are doing, right? Even when they're privileged, they're aware that other girls are not the same. And I think at this rate, like I want to add something positive. And we all know that gender inequality is a big part of all of this, because there's career responsibilities and the housework and the perspectives and early marriage and all of that. And one of the things we're noticing is, and this is again is something we're still analyzing, but like girls are like there's a change in girls' attitudes, and there's a change. Well, what our colleagues who've been researching these countries for much longer than us tell us is a change in their perceptions of what they want for the future. And many more girls across the social spectrum, across urban and rural areas, are saying, I want to delay my marriage, I want to achieve this in education, I want other girls to be safe, I want other girls to not be, as I said, like in prostitution or to be able to access health. And they have very much a gender awareness, and there is like some evidence of, at least for us, for the girls we talk to, of like yes, changing in ideas about gender. And if these girls were more educated, progress and get into like positions in which they can make decisions, there is hope that they will make positive decisions for other girls as well, right? It is very much what happened here in the global north, if you want. So there's also positive things happening, and the girls are driving those positive things as well.
Yes, and one thing that is really important also is sometimes the literature has very deficit view about the poor, and in particular for parents in rural contexts, for example, are labeled as resistance and that kind of stuff. I mean, we have done that for years and years in the literature. Some of the data actually questions those kind of assumptions that we carry and we amplify. And the efforts they are putting from very little they have to support their children to go through schooling is really, really important. I think that we need to recognize as researchers and as governments. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I think that might be a good place to end on that positive note. I think it's definitely, it's a challenging area, but there are the positives that it's really important to recognize as well. So we haven't managed to get Anita back, unfortunately, but Tigist, I'll send her your question via email, and then hopefully you can just take that discussion further. So I'm just going to load up my screen. Let me know when you can see it. Okay, fantastic. So I just want to take this opportunity once again to thank our 4 fantastic speakers, and thank you to all the participants as well for attending and for engaging with the questions at the end and leading to what was actually a really interesting discussion, and hopefully there's space there to take those important topics forward. Clearly COVID-19 is having wide-ranging, complex and devastating impacts on communities across the world and those in poverty, and also it will be those who are in the poorer sectors of community in the poorer countries who will be disproportionately affected, exacerbating existing socioeconomic and ethnic inequalities. But hopefully by coming together and learning about different perspectives, approaches and challenges, we can be better situated to individually and collectively make a positive impact. So please do keep in touch. If you did want to send any follow-on questions to any of our speakers, I'd be very happy to forward them on. We've got our contact details, I'll just get up on screen here. And then that's also got our website if you want to find out more about us on our Twitter page. And moving forward, as Tigist mentioned, we do have our big online conference running from the 27th to the 29th of April, which is exploring poverty and the sustainable development goals from the local to the global. As Tigist mentioned, we've got one of the sessions within that conference will be on education, which actually Tigist and some of her colleagues will be involved in directly. We've also got sessions on livelihoods and debt, on child health and development, on food and nutrition and multidimensional poverty measurements, as well as a policy focused session, which is involving non-academic communities in particular. We'll have non-academic speakers throughout the conference and hopefully people with lived experience of poverty, because we really want to ensure that those voices are represented. So there's more information on our website, which you can see on the slide, and we are hoping to launch registration in the next week or so, which is really exciting. So do get in touch if you're interested in finding out more about the conference, or keep an eye on our Twitter and website, because it will all be announced there. So finally, just want to say I hope you've enjoyed this webinar, that you found it interesting and informative, and it's given you a better understanding of some of the challenges and issues related to girls in low and middle income countries, which COVID-19 has exposed and or exacerbated, and it's really kind of got your thoughts going on that area and the ways in which we as a community of both researchers and practitioners can try and make a difference, a positive difference in those girls' lives and obviously in their wider communities. So thank you again for attending, and thanks again to our speakers, of course, who were all fantastic, and have a good afternoon or morning or evening wherever you are in the world. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.